common sense ain't that common anymore. Seems common sense is past tense, just like the dinosaur. Political correctness has got a lot to answer for, 'cause common sense ain't that common anymore.
Now on weekends, the Treasury of Common Sense.
We love it. Each Saturday, a chat with Leith Van Onselen, Chief Economist at the MB Fund and MB Super, macrobusiness.com.au. Good morning.
Good day, Luke. How are you?
I'm very well, mate. Lovely to talk to you again. Fewer Australians can afford to have children.
Yeah, this is interesting. So we had former Treasurer Peter Costello. He was interviewed by the ABC this week, where he called on the federal government to take action to arrest the nation's plummeting birth rate. Now, listeners might remember that Costello was, of course, the architect of the early 2000s baby bonus, and that temporarily boosted the nation's birth rate in the early to mid-2000s. And Australia's birth rate's basically been declining for 70 years. The latest data from the ABS showed that it's tracking at an all-time low of just 1.5 babies per woman. And the ABS also reports that the median age of parents has hit a record high as well. So obviously Australians are older and they're having fewer children. And here's the thing that's quite an interesting stat. So Australia's current fertility rate of 1.5 babies per woman is only slightly higher than Japan's was a decade ago. Now, remember, a decade ago, Japan's is lower now, but a decade ago, everyone was worried about Japan basically, facing demographic crisis, that sort of thing. So we're pretty much where Japan was a decade ago, which is quite interesting. And the latest population data from the ABS showed that the natural increase, which is basically births minus deaths, is also tracking at a historical low. And the latest household income and labour dynamics survey in Australia that was released a few months ago showed that Australians are opting to have fewer children. There's also more childless couples, and that this is basically a growing trend. And to nobody's surprise, the Hilda survey showed that the number one reason behind Australia's decline in the fertility rate is financial concerns. Right now, it's not the only factor, but housing costs, I argue, are one of the main reasons for this, because as I mentioned last week, housing affordability, both the purchase and rent, is tracking at a record low. So, as I mentioned last week, the cost of renting a home in Australia is basically so if you want to rent the median advertised home now, you're paying $10,600 more annually than you would have 5 years ago. I mentioned that last week, and obviously the cost of housing just to buy has gone through the roof as well. So it's very, very expensive. And there was some data released by HSBC on Australia, and they argued that every 10% increase in house prices leads to a 1.3% drop in birth rates.
Wow.
And they said that it's even worse if rents go up.
Yeah. And
this sort of data has been replicated across other nations like the US, etc. And obviously, the cost of housing is playing a part in this. And also the other interesting thing is housing's cheaper in the regions than is in the capital cities. And reflecting that, the birth rate in the regions is significantly higher than the capital cities. And so one of the ways the government has tried to get around this, obviously, is tried to ramp up immigration. But the problem with doing that is that it's a two-factor problem. Obviously, if you ramp up immigration, you then push up the cost of renting in particular, but also prices. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. You can bring people in to try to compensate for your falling birth rate, but then you drive up the cost of housing, which then leads to a lower birth rate. So that's one of the problems. The other problem is that, surprisingly, the two biggest migrant groups we have now, which is India and China, they actually have fewer children than the rest of us on average. So we're bringing in a whole bunch of migrant groups who are, now I'm not having a shot at them at this, but this is just a fact, that parents from India and China who've come from India and China tend to have lower births than the Australian-born women. So that then also has an impact on the falling birth rate. Now, the solution to Australia's low birth rate is obviously to bring down the structural cost of housing and lower cost of living generally. And unfortunately, as I mentioned last week, all the indicators are going in the wrong direction. So we've got, obviously house prices surging again at a record high relative to incomes, and obviously rents have gone up 40-odd% since the pandemic. And as I mentioned before, to rent the median home now is $10,600 more than it was 5 years ago. So this just means that the birth rate's going to continue to fall if this isn't arrested. But it also means the government's likely to then ramp up immigration more to compensate. But then that has a negative feedback loop of pushing up housing and then, pushing down the birth rate. So we're sort of caught between a catch-22.
Yeah.
And instead of throwing money at it, which I think is what Peter Costello's trying to suggest, another baby bonus, that sort of thing, which gives you a sort of temporary sugar hit, but it's not long-lasting. We need to focus more on the cost of living side and the housing side and try and bring down the cost of housing. That's the ultimate solution. Otherwise, families are going to have fewer children. And one last thing on this topic, Luke, it's also very hard to raise a family when we're now expected to live in high-rise shoeboxes. So, all the governments across Australia now want Australia to densify. They want us to live in apartments, all that sort of thing. Most of the apartments being built are 1- and 2-bedroom apartments. We'll try and raise a family in that. They're not very conducive to raising a family. So we're also turning the structure of the nation's housing market into shoeboxes, which then is a disincentive for people to try and have children because it's very hard to raise a children in that way. So that's another problem we've got.
It's amazing to think that we've got in the country that we know and love and we grew up in, to think we got to a point where the financial consideration is now the key consideration in deciding on a family. I mean, that's where we find ourselves, and God, I mean, you just despair at how we got here. We got here, we didn't just sneak our way into this position. This has happened. People paid a bit more attention, and I'm sorry to reflect on those that turn up for a sausage every 3 years, but if you just kind of just think deeper about stuff, it might just help the collective. It's something I want to perhaps arrogantly say. Now, the clown music, because we have a clown this week, mate. Now, this bloke come to my attention a week or two back, and I'm glad you've got your sights set on him. Tell us about Andrew McLachlan. First off, who the hell is he?
Yeah, well, mate, to be honest with you, I'd never heard of this guy, but he's a backbencher Liberal Senator from South Australia. And this week he was interviewed by The Guardian, or maybe it was last week, but he was interviewed by The Guardian, and he basically attacked the coalition. So The Guardian's obviously a left-wing rag, right? And most of the readers wouldn't vote for the coalition anyway. They tend to be Greens voters, that sort of thing. So he was interviewed by them, and he attacked the coalition for daring to use the phrase mass migration, which he claimed was, quote, not only technically inaccurate, but also irresponsible and inflammatory. And he basically likened it to dog whistling and racism. But the hilarious thing is, Andrew McLachlan should actually go and read The Economist magazine, because The Economist magazine, which is actually pro-migration, they published a massive report a year or so ago where they used the term in the title mass migration to describe the mass flow of people from developing nations to developed nations after the pandemic. And they explicitly featured Australia because Australia had been one of the leaders in the migration surge. Now, obviously, Australia's run one of the strongest immigration programs in the world this century. It's grown our population by just under 9 million people so far this century, if you base off the latest ABS population clock. We've outpaced virtually every other developed nation this century on population growth, thanks to our huge mass migration. And since the beginning of 2005, which is when we ramped up immigration, it's more than doubled. We've averaged a whopping just under 230,000 net overseas migration annually, and that's about 150% higher than the historical average after World War II. Now, and the government's own projections say that we're going to run mass migration. So the Centre for Population's annual report, they haven't released the one this year. The latest one we got was December 2024, last year. They actually forecast that the population is going to grow by about 50% over the next 40 years. We're going to add another Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane number of people to the population just 40 years. Now, that, I don't know how anyone could not describe that as mass migration.
Completely.
When you grow the population so aggressively.
Yep.
And, and the federal government's own advisory council on housing supply and affordability, National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, they say that we cannot keep up and that Australia's housing shortage is going to worsen over the next 5 years by about 79,000 homes. And that's based off pretty conservative population forecasts that we're already running ahead of. So, and let's not forget that every single opinion poll pretty much conducted over the last 10 years, both before and after the pandemic, has shown that Australians want significantly lower immigration and that we do not support a big Australia. So for me, Luke, I think it's time that politicians like Andrew McLachlan represent the views of Australians who overwhelmingly want lower immigration rather than try and pander to the woke minority at The Guardian who, let's face it, will never vote for the coalition anyway. Otherwise, with views like this, the coalition deserves to be annihilated.
Yeah, well, they're doing a good job of that themselves. Thank you, mate. Merry Christmas. Great to chat. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. Speak next year.
That is Leith Van Onselen. Back in a moment.